Stopping Glory by Kyle Byram. The sky above the festival grounds glimmered with streaks of neon green and electric purple, the reflections of thousands of LED bracelets and stage lights merging into a kaleidoscope of color. The air pulsed with bass, each beat vibrating through the earth, as though the very ground danced to the rhythm. Solar Pulse wasn't just a music festival, it was a universe of its own, one where the rules of reality bent and twisted under the spell of euphoria. Ella adjusted the strap of her backpack, her gaze sweeping over the endless sea of revelers. Everywhere she looked, people were swaying, jumping, and twirling, their faces alight with joy and abandon. She envied their ease but couldn't shake the nagging discomfort in her chest. Something about this year's festival felt off. "Ella, you got to loosen up," Marcus said, tugging her arm. His wiry frame jittered with excitement, a sharp contrast to her tense demeanor. "This is our last hurrah before the real world swallows us whole. Live a little." "I am living," she said, forcing a smile. "Just observing too." Ahead of them, Danny and Trey had already immersed themselves in the crowd. Danny's platinum blonde hair glinted under the strobes, her laughter ringing out above the music. Trey, ever the daredevil, had scaled a barricade and was now leading a chant that rippled through the audience like a wave. "Come on!" Danny called, holding up a small, glossy vial. "It's Glory! Everyone's talking about it! They say it's like touching heaven." Ella's stomach churned. She'd heard the whispers about Glory. A new designer drug, rumored to heighten every sensation, to make music sound like divinity and lights look like portals to other realms. But no one seemed to know where it came from or who was distributing it. That mystery gnawed at her. "Don't tell me you're thinking about it," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. "It's a festival," Danny said with a shrug. "If not here, then where?" She tossed the vial to Trey, who uncapped it with a flourish and downed its contents in one swift motion. Marcus glanced at Ella, his expression torn. "It's one night," he said, more to himself than to her. "One memory." He turned back to Danny. "Just don't overdo it, okay?" Ella bit her tongue. Arguing with them would only alienate her, and the last thing she wanted was to spend the weekend alone. Instead, she stuck close to Marcus as the night deepened, the music's intensity growing with each passing hour. Around midnight, the effects of Glory began to show. Trey moved like a marionette, his limbs jerking in perfect sync with the bass drops. Danny's laughter grew manic, her eyes reflecting the strobe lights like mirrors. They weren't alone, hundreds, maybe thousands, of festival goers danced with a frenzied energy that seemed almost inhuman. Ella shivered, stepping back from the crowd. "Marcus, do you see that?" He nodded, his face pale. "There, two synchronized." The realization hit Ella like a cold wave, it wasn't just the music or the drugs. Something deeper, something primal, was taking hold of the crowd. She tugged on Marcus's sleeve. "We need to find a quieter spot." As they made their way toward the edges of the festival grounds, Ella caught snippets of conversation. "Best high of my life," one man said, his pupils blown wide. "Feels like I'm part of something bigger," another murmured, his voice trembling with reverence. Ella glanced back toward the main stage. For a brief moment, she swore she saw Danny standing unnaturally still in the middle of the throng, her head tilted back, her arms slack at her sides. But before Ella could point her out, the crowd swallowed her up again. As the night wore on, the music pounded louder, and the crowd's movements grew more erratic. Ella and Marcus sat in the shadow of a food truck, watching the chaos unfold. "I don't like this," Ella said softly. Marcus didn't reply. His gaze was fixed on the crowd, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the truck's counter. The first scream pierced the air just before dawn. The scream wasn't the kind that came from joy or surprise, it was raw, primal, and full of terror. It cut through the thundering music like a blade, making Ella's heart stop. She shot to her feet, clutching Marcus's arm as the sound was swallowed by the night. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Marcus nodded, his eyes scanning the crowd. "Yeah! Over there!" He pointed toward the center of the festival grounds, where the main stage towered above the sea of bodies. For a moment, nothing seemed out of place. The crowd still swayed and pulsed, their movements eerily synchronized with the rhythm. But then Ella saw it. One by one, people started to stop moving, freezing mid-dance. A man stood with his arms raised as if in worship, his face turned skyward. A woman sat on the ground, her head tilted to the side, her hair falling like a curtain. Dozens, then hundreds, joined them, motionless statues scattered among the living. "What the hell is going on?" Marcus muttered, his voice tight with fear. Ella pulled him back into the shadow of the food truck, her breathing shallow. "It's the glory," she said. "It has to be. Everyone who took it, they're not moving. Danny! Trey!" Marcus's voice broke as he said their names. Ella swallowed hard, the image of Danny standing still in the crowd flashing through her mind. "We have to find them," she said, though every instinct in her body screamed to run in the opposite direction. The festival grounds felt like a battlefield as they made their way through the scattered remains of the night's revelry. Glow sticks and empty cups littered the ground, and the once vibrant music now sounded distorted, like a warped record. They found Danny first. She was standing near one of the smaller stages, her hands limp at her sides. Her usually expressive face was blank, her eyes unblinking. "Danny?" Marcus said, stepping toward her. Ella grabbed his arm, holding him back. "Don't," she warned. She's not one of them," Marcus argued, his voice rising in desperation. "She's not herself either," Ella said. "Look at her!" Danny didn't respond to their voices, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. It was as if she was asleep with her eyes open, locked in some terrible dream. "Let's find Trey," Ella said, her voice trembling. "Maybe he's still..." She couldn't finish the sentence. They moved quickly now, their fear propelling them forward. Trey was harder to find. The sky was beginning to lighten, the first hints of dawn painting the horizon in muted shades of grey. "Over there," Marcus whispered, pointing toward a cluster of frozen figures near the Ferris wheel. Trey stood among them, his body slack but upright. His festival band, the one he'd been so proud of, dangled loosely from his wrist. His face was the same as Danny's, expressionless, devoid of life. The first rays of sunlight broke over the festival, and everything changed. At first, it was subtle. A twitch of a hand here, a slight turn of a head there. But then the movement became more pronounced. The motionless figures started to jerk and writhe, their movements sharp and unnatural. "Oh no," Ella whispered, stepping back. One by one, the frozen figures turned their heads toward the unaffected, their eyes now glowing with an otherworldly light. A low growl rippled through the air, rising in pitch until it became an unholy scream. "They're waking up," Marcus said, his voice filled with dread. And then they charged. The infected moved with a speed and ferocity that defied logic. Their bodies contorted as they lunged at anyone nearby, teeth bared and hands clawing. The screams of the survivors filled the air, blending with the distorted music in a symphony of terror. Ella grabbed Marcus's hand and ran, her heart pounding as they weaved through the chaos. Behind them, the infected tore through the festival goers, their attacks brutal and unrelenting. "This way!" Marcus shouted, pulling her toward a maintenance tent. They ducked inside, slamming the flimsy door shut behind them. Outside, the sounds of carnage grew louder, mingling with the rising sun's deceptive warmth. "We're not safe here," Ella said, her voice shaking. "I know," Marcus replied, his face pale. "But where else can we go?" Ella didn't have an answer. The festival had become a nightmare, and the dawn offered no salvation, only blood and horror. The maintenance tent was suffocating, its vinyl walls offering a flimsy barrier between them and the chaos outside. Ella could still hear the guttural growls and agonized screams, the sounds growing sharper as the infected tore through the festival grounds. She pressed her hand over her mouth, trying to steady her breathing. "Do you think they saw us coming here?" Marcus escaped her, his back against the tent wall, his eyes wide and unfocused. "I don't know," Ella replied, her voice barely audible. Her mind raced, replaying the moment the infected sprang to life. There had been no warning, no logic to their transformation. It was as if the rising sun had flipped a switch, turning the euphoric festival goers into feral predators. Marcus peeked through a slit in the tent's fabric. The carnage outside was inescapable. A group of uninfected survivors bolted past, their terrified faces streaked with sweat and tears. Behind them, 3 infected figures gave chase, their movements unnervingly erratic but horrifyingly fast. "We can't stay here," Marcus said, turning back to Ella. She nodded. "We need a plan. Somewhere to go." "Like where?" "The whole place is crawling with them." Marcus's voice cracked, his fear seeping through the thin veneer of composure he tried to maintain. Ella scanned the dim interior of the tent. It was cluttered with tools, spare electrical cables, and a battered walkie-talkie resting on a crate. She grabbed the device, turning it over in her hands. "Maybe this still works," she said, flipping the switch. Static crackled, followed by faint voices. "Any survivors, head to the northeast gate, barricading the perimeter." Ella's heart leapt. "Did you hear that? The northeast gate! There are other survivors!" Marcus hesitated, his face a mix of hope and doubt. "How do we know it's real? What if it's a trap?" "We don't," Ella admitted. "But staying here is suicide." Marcus exhaled, running a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. "Fine. But we stick together, no matter what." Ella nodded, gripping the walkie-talkie tightly as they peeked out of the tent. The festival grounds were a battlefield now. Bodies littered the ground, some mutilated beyond recognition. The infected prowled among the wreckage, their glowing eyes scanning for movement. "Stay low," Ella whispered, pulling Marcus toward the back of the tent. They slipped out through a gap in the fabric, crouching behind a stack of collapsed barricades. The trek to the northeast gate was a harrowing gauntlet. Every few steps, they had to duck behind debris or freeze as an infected figure darted too close. Ella's chest burned from holding her breath, her muscles tense and ready to spring at any moment. At one point, they passed a group of infected feasting on a body. The wet, visceral sounds turned Ella's stomach, but she forced herself to keep moving. Beside her, Marcus clenched his jaw, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. When they were halfway to the gate, a loud crash erupted nearby. Ella turned to see a man, a survivor, scrambling over a pile of wreckage. He was bleeding heavily, his shirt torn to shreds. "Help!" he cried, his voice hoarse. The infected turned in unison, their heads snapping toward the sound like predators honing in on prey. Ella grabbed Marcus's arm, her heart pounding. "We can't do anything," she whispered. Marcus looked like he wanted to argue, but the man's screams were cut short as the infected descended on him. The sound of tearing flesh filled the air. They didn't stop running until the northeast gate came into view. A makeshift barricade of metal fencing and overturned festival carts blocked the entrance, and a handful of survivors stood guard with improvised weapons, metal pipes, wooden planks, even a fire extinguisher. "Hey!" Marcus shouted, waving his arms. The guards turned, their faces a mixture of relief and suspicion. One of them, a burly man with a bloody crowbar, motioned for them to hurry. Ella and Marcus scrambled over the barricade, collapsing to the ground on the other side. For the first time in what felt like hours, Ella allowed herself to breathe. "What's going on out there?" one of the guards asked, his voice tight. "It's the glory," Ella said, her throat dry. "Everyone who took it, they've turned into monsters." The group exchanged uneasy glances. "It's not just out there," the burly man said grimly. "We've had people inside the barricade turn, too. We're not safe here." Ella's blood ran cold. The infected weren't the only danger, they might already be among them. The northeast gate, once a bastion of hope, now felt like a death trap. The survivors clustered inside the barricade were a mix of the terrified and the defiant, their faces illuminated by the pale morning light. Some clutched makeshift weapons, while others cradled injuries, their eyes darting toward every sound. Ella leaned against a stack of pallets, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. Marcus sat beside her, his face pale and streaked with grime. "This isn't going to hold," Marcus muttered, gesturing toward the barricade. "If they charge all at once?" Ella didn't answer. She didn't need to, he was right. The barricade, hastily assembled with festival scraps, was a fragile illusion of safety. The burly man with the crowbar, who had introduced himself as Saul, took charge of the group. He stood at the center, his voice low but commanding. We don't know how this thing spreads. It could be in the air, through contact, we don't know. What we do know is anyone who took that drug is a threat." His gaze swept over the group, landing on a skinny teenager with a bloody bandage wrapped around his arm. The kid flinched under the scrutiny. "What happened to you?" Saul asked, his tone sharp. I fell," the boy stammered. "Cut myself on some metal." Saul stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "You sure about that? No bites? No scratches?" The kid shook his head furiously, but the doubt hung heavy in the air. "We can't take chances," a woman interjected. She was middle-aged, with streaks of gray in her hair and a kitchen knife clutched tightly in her hand. "If he's infected, we're all dead." "He's not infected," another voice argued, this one belonging to a young woman who stepped forward, placing herself protectively in front of the boy. "He's my brother. He's fine." The group erupted into a chorus of raised voices, the tension mounting. Ella exchanged a glance with Marcus, her stomach churning. "This is falling apart," Marcus whispered. "Stop!" Saul's voice cut through the argument like a whip. He raised the crowbar, pointing it at the siblings. "We'll keep him under watch. But if he shows any signs at all, we put him down." The girl looked ready to argue, but the deadly seriousness in Saul's expression silenced her. She nodded reluctantly, pulling her brother close. As the group settled into uneasy silence, Ella approached Saul. "Do we have a plan?" she asked. Saul exhaled, rubbing a hand over his stubble. "Plan? The plan is to survive until help arrives." "If it arrives?" Ella's stomach sank. "We can't just wait here. What if the infected overwhelm us? What if no one comes?" Saul's jaw tightened. "Then we fight." The hours dragged on, the tension inside the barricade growing heavier with each passing minute. The infected outside prowled like wolves, their glowing eyes peering through gaps in the barricade. Every so often, one of them would lunge at the fence, testing its strength. When dusk began to fall, the atmosphere shifted. The faintest glimmers of hope were snuffed out as the survivors realized the infected didn't seem to tire. The first crack came when the boy, the one with the bandaged arm, started to twitch. Ella noticed it first. She was sitting nearby, trying to rest, when she saw his fingers jerking spasmodically. His sister, who had been dozing against his shoulder, didn't notice. "Marcus," Ella whispered, nudging him. He followed her gaze and went pale. "Oh no!" Before they could act, the boy let out a guttural growl, his body convulsing violently. His sister jolted awake, screaming as her brother lunged at her, his teeth snapping inches from her face. The barricade erupted into chaos. Survivors scrambled away, some grabbing weapons while others bolted toward the edges of the encampment. "Get him off her!" Saul shouted, rushing forward with his crowbar raised. The infected boy was unnaturally strong, thrashing wildly as Saul and another man wrestled him to the ground. His sister sobbed uncontrollably, her hands covered in his blood. "He's turning!" someone yelled. Saul didn't hesitate. He brought the crowbar down with a sickening crunch, silencing the boy's growls. The group stood in stunned silence, the reality of their situation sinking in. Ella's heart pounded as she met Marcus's horrified gaze. "Nowhere is safe," she whispered. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, the infected outside began to howl, their cries echoing into the night. The infected howls reverberated across the festival grounds, a blood-curdling symphony of hunger and rage. The survivors huddled together near the barricade, their faces illuminated by a flickering lantern. Shadows danced wildly on the tarp walls, mirroring their growing panic. "They're getting louder," Marcus muttered, gripping a jagged piece of rebar like a lifeline. Ella scanned the group. The tension from the earlier chaos lingered, every survivor avoiding the sight of the boy's crumpled body at the edge of the camp. His sister sat nearby, her face buried in her hands, silent but trembling. "We can't stay here," Ella said firmly, addressing Saul. "They're circling us, testing us. It's only a matter of time before they rush the barricade." Saul turned toward her, his face drawn with exhaustion. "And where do you suggest we go, huh? You see a better option out there?" He gestured to the dark festival grounds beyond the fence. There's got to be somewhere safer, Ella insisted. Somewhere more defensible. Saul shook his head. You don't get it, do you? It's not just them out there, he said, pointing toward the infected. It's us. It's what we're turning into. You want to run, fine, but don't come crying when this whole thing spreads and we're no better off than they are. The survivors muttered among themselves, uncertainty rippling through the group. Marcus stepped forward. Ella's right. Sitting here is a death sentence. We need a plan to move, find a building, a vehicle, something. Saul's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Fine. We scout. But nobody goes alone. The decision made, they divided into smaller groups. Saul would stay back with a few others to guard the barricade, while Ella, Marcus, and a wiry guy named Trevor ventured out toward the festival's main stage area. The night was a predator's dream, pitch black, save for the scattered beams of moonlight cutting through the chaos. The trio moved cautiously, their steps muffled by the layers of trash and mud coating the ground. The remnants of the festival sprawled before them like a battlefield. Tents were shredded, food trucks overturned, and the ground was littered with debris. And then there were the bodies. Stay close, Ella whispered, her eyes scanning the shadows. As they passed the collapsed food stand, a sudden movement caught Marcus's eye. He froze, raising a hand to signal the others. What is it? Trevor hissed, clutching a sharpened metal pole. Something moved, Marcus whispered, pointing toward the wreckage. They crouched, straining their ears. The faint sound of labored breathing reached them, followed by a low groan. Ella's grip on her improvised weapon tightened. It could be someone uninfected, Marcus said. Or it could be a trap, Trevor countered, his voice taut. Ella crept closer, her heart pounding. As she rounded the corner, she saw a figure slumped against the wreckage. A man, his face pale and drenched in sweat, clutched his abdomen. His bloodied shirt was torn, revealing a jagged wound. Help, he croaked, his voice barely audible. Ella glanced back at the others. He's hurt. I think he's clean. Don't get too close, Trevor warned. Ignoring him, Ella knelt beside the man. What happened to you? She asked. They came out of nowhere, he gasped. My group, they didn't make it. Ella nodded, her throat tight. Can you walk? He shook his head weakly. I don't think so. Trevor stepped forward, his expression hard. We don't have time for this. If he can't move, we leave him. We're not leaving him, Ella snapped. As they argued, the man's breathing grew shallower. His eyes rolled back, and his body convulsed. No, Ella whispered, backing away. It was too late. His eyes snapped open, glowing with the same eerie light as the infected. His mouth twisted into a snarl as he lunged at Ella. Trevor reacted first, driving his pole through the man's chest. The infected man screamed, thrashing violently before collapsing in a heap. Ella staggered back, her hands shaking. We need to go, she said, her voice trembling. The commotion had drawn attention. Infected figures began emerging from the shadows, their glowing eyes locking onto the trio. Run! Marcus shouted. They sprinted back toward the barricade, the guttural cries of the infected echoing behind them. Ella's lungs burned, her legs threatening to give out, but she didn't dare slow down. When they reached the barricade, Saul and the others were already bracing for impact. What the hell did you bring back? Saul shouted. The infected, they're coming, Marcus yelled. And as the howls grew deafening, the first of the infected hurled itself against the barricade, marking the start of another night of terror. The barricade buckled under the relentless assault of the infected. They clawed, snarled, and threw themselves against the fragile walls, driven by an insatiable hunger. The survivors worked in frantic synchronization, reinforcing weak points with whatever they could find, metal scraps, wooden planks, and festival debris. Hold it, Saul bellowed, using his crowbar to shove back a bloody figure trying to climb the barricade. Ella gritted her teeth as she swung a length of pipe, the impact sending shocks up her arms. The infected she struck crumpled to the ground, only for another to take its place. This won't last, Marcus shouted over the chaos. Then make it last, Saul snapped, his voice tinged with desperation. Inside the barricade, the atmosphere was suffocating. People screamed, wept, and prayed as the horde intensified its attack. Ella's gaze flicked to the survivors' faces, searching for strength but finding only terror. And then, without warning, a section of the barricade gave way. It happened so fast, a deafening crash, splintered wood flying, and a flood of glowing-eyed attackers pouring through the breach. The survivors scattered, their fragile unity dissolving in an instant. "Fall back!" Saul roared, swinging his weapon with brutal efficiency. Ella grabbed Marcus's arm, yanking him toward the center of the encampment. "We have to regroup." "What regroup?" "We're screwed," Marcus yelled, his voice cracking. The infected surged like a tidal wave, their grotesque snarls filling the air. Ella spotted Trevor struggling against one of them, his metal pole buried in the creature's chest. But even impaled, it didn't stop, it only grew more frenzied. "Trevor!" She screamed, but the mob swallowed him before she could reach him. The survivors who could still move bolted toward the far edge of the encampment, seeking an exit. Ella and Marcus followed, their breaths ragged and hearts pounding. Behind them, the barricade was a storm of chaos, survivors who didn't escape were dragged down, their screams abruptly silenced. Ella didn't dare look back as she and Marcus reached the outer perimeter. Saul was already there, yanking open a gate partially blocked by debris. "This way!" he shouted. One by one, the survivors poured through, their numbers now pitifully small. As the last person stumbled out, Saul slammed the gate shut, wedging a metal pole between the handles. "It won't hold them for long," Saul said grimly, turning to face the shell-shocked group. There were only 10 of them now, each face etched with exhaustion and horror. The infected continued to batter the gate, their glowing eyes peering through the gaps. "Where do we go now?" someone asked, their voice trembling. "There's a service tunnel," Marcus said suddenly. "I saw it near the east stage earlier. It might lead to the festival's maintenance area." Saul nodded. "Better than standing here like sitting ducks. Move!" The group hurried eastward, sticking close together. The festival grounds had transformed into a nightmarish labyrinth. Glow sticks and LED lights from abandoned rave gear flickered in the distance, casting eerie shadows. As they moved, the group passed more bodies, some torn apart, others eerily untouched. "Do you think they'll stop?" Marcus whispered to Ella, his voice low. "What do you mean?" "After they've killed everyone. Do you think they'll stop, or will they turn on each other?" Ella didn't answer. She didn't want to think about it. When they reached the service tunnel, Marcus's instincts proved correct. A heavy metal door, rusted but still functional, stood at the entrance. "Help me with this," Saul said, gesturing to Marcus. Together, they heaved the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. The group hurried inside, the air growing cooler and mustier as they descended. The tunnel was narrow and dimly lit by flickering overhead bulbs. It smelled of mildew and oil, the sounds of their footsteps echoing unnervingly. "Is this safe?" the middle-aged woman with the knife asked. "No," Saul replied bluntly. "But it's safer than out there." The group moved deeper into the tunnel, their nerves fraying with every step. Ella stayed near the back, keeping watch for any sign of pursuit. Then, a sound. Faint at first, but unmistakable, the shuffling of feet and the low, guttural growls of the infected. "They're in the tunnels," Marcus said, his voice barely a whisper. Panic rippled through the group. "We keep moving," Saul ordered, raising his crowbar. "Don't stop for anything." As the sound grew louder, Ella felt her heart sink. They had escaped the surface, only to find themselves cornered underground. The infected were relentless, and now the walls were closing in. The group pressed forward through the narrow service tunnel, their breathing labored and their steps hurried. The air grew heavier with each passing moment, the oppressive darkness amplifying every sound, the creak of old pipes, the shuffle of debris beneath their feet, and the distant growls of the infected. "Keep moving," Saul commanded in a hushed tone, his voice sharp with authority. He held the crowbar in front of him like a talisman, his knuckles white. Ella lingered near the rear of the group, her eyes darting toward the tunnel's entrance. The faint, Otherworldly glow of the infected eyes was growing brighter, their guttural moans echoing like ghostly warnings. "We're being hunted," Marcus whispered, his voice trembling as he glanced back. "Don't look," Ella snapped. "Just keep going." The tunnel took a sudden turn, leading them to a junction. 3 paths stretched out before them, each equally foreboding. Rusted signs hung loosely from the walls, their faded lettering barely legible in the dim light. "Which way?" the middle-aged woman asked, her knife shaking in her grip. Saul studied the signs, his jaw tight. "Maintenance access. Storage. Generator room," he read aloud. "Generator room might have tools. Maybe even a map." "We don't have time for maybe," Marcus said, his voice rising. "They're getting closer." The infected were no longer just distant sounds, they were near enough to hear the scrape of nails against the concrete walls. "Generator room it is," Saul decided, leading them down the rightmost tunnel. As they hurried, the growls grew louder, closer. The sound wasn't just coming from behind, it was ahead of them now, too. "Wait," Ella whispered, grabbing Saul's arm. The group froze. A low snarl emerged from the shadows ahead, followed by the unmistakable shuffling of feet. "They're in front of us," Marcus hissed, his face pale. Panic surged. They were boxed in. "This way!" Ella pointed to a narrow vent cover on the side wall. She hurried over, prying at the metal grate with her bare hands. "It won't fit all of us," Saul growled. "It'll fit enough to buy time." Ella shot back, desperation fueling her strength. With Marcus's help, they wrenched the grate free, revealing a dark crawlspace just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. "Go, now!" Saul barked, shoving the woman inside first. One by one, they clambered into the crawlspace, the walls pressing uncomfortably close. Ella waited for Marcus and Saul to follow, her heart hammering in her chest as the infected rounded the corner behind them. The glow of their eyes was blinding now, their snarls deafening in the confined tunnel. Saul pushed Marcus into the crawlspace and turned back, swinging his crowbar with a roar. "Saul!" Ella screamed. "Keep going!" Saul yelled, his voice strained as he fought off the first infected to lunge at him. "Don't look back!" Ella hesitated, but Marcus grabbed her arm, pulling her into the crawlspace. "We can't help him now," he said grimly. They crawled through the narrow passage, the echoes of Saul's struggle growing fainter. The space was stifling, every movement scraping against the cold metal walls. "I can't do this," the woman ahead of Ella whimpered, her breathing ragged. "You have to," Ella said, her voice hard. "Just keep moving." The crawlspace opened into a small storage room, its walls lined with shelves of old tools and supplies. The survivors spilled out, gasping for air, their faces streaked with grime and sweat. "Saul!" Marcus muttered, his voice breaking. Ella leaned against the wall, her mind racing. "He bought us time! We need to use it!" The infected snarls were muffled now, but they wouldn't stay that way for long. Ella scanned the room, searching for anything they could use. Her eyes landed on a rusted axe and a bundle of heavy-duty zip ties. "Arm yourselves," she said, tossing the axe to Marcus. "What's the plan now?" the woman asked, clutching her knife tightly. Ella took a deep breath, steadying herself. "We find another exit. And we survive." But as they prepared to move, a faint tapping sound echoed through the room. It wasn't the infected, it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. "Do you hear that?" Marcus asked, his eyes wide. Ella nodded, her stomach churning. The sound was coming from the far corner of the room, where a rusted locker stood slightly ajar. "Check it," Ella said, her voice low. Marcus hesitated before stepping forward. He raised the axe, his hands trembling, and pulled the locker open. A figure tumbled out, pale and emaciated, its eyes wild with fear. "Please," the person whispered, their voice cracking. "Don't let them find me!" The group stared in stunned silence, their brief moment of safety shattered by the realization, they weren't alone. The emaciated figure on the floor trembled, shielding their face as though expecting an attack. The group stood frozen, their breaths caught in their throats. Ella was the first to move, kneeling cautiously. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice low but firm. The stranger flinched, glancing up with hollow, bloodshot eyes. "My name is Ren," they croaked, their voice dry and rasping. "I've been hiding since it started." Marcus lowered the axe slightly but didn't let his guard down. "How long have you been in here?" Ren's gaze darted nervously around the room. "Since the first night. I saw them change. I barely made it to the locker before they turned on each other. I thought I was safe, but they've been looking for me." Ella narrowed her eyes. "What do you mean, looking? They can't think like that." Ren shook their head vigorously. "No, you don't understand. They can smell you if you're not one of them. They remember." A heavy silence settled over the room as the survivors processed Ren's words. If the infected could track them, their chances of staying hidden were even slimmer. "Why haven't they gotten you yet?" Marcus asked, suspicion lacing his voice. "I don't know," Ren whispered. "I've been careful. Moved only when I had to. They're unpredictable." Saul's absence weighed heavily on Ella. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to focus. "Ren, do you know a way out of here?" Ren hesitated, then nodded weakly. "The tunnels connect to the festival's main power grid. There's an emergency exit, but it's locked. You'd need a keycard to open it." "Where's the keycard?" Marcus asked sharply. "In the security office, near the central hub," Ren replied, their voice trembling. "But it's crawling with them. I couldn't risk it." Ella exchanged a glance with Marcus and the rest of the group. The plan was clear, but the risks were immense. "We don't have a choice," Ella said, standing. "If we stay here, we're dead. If we go for the keycard, we might have a shot." "That's a big maybe," Marcus muttered, but he didn't argue. The survivors prepared to leave, gathering what little supplies they had. Ren, though weak, insisted on coming with them. "I know the way," they said, their determination surprising. The group stepped back into the tunnel, every sound amplified in the suffocating darkness. Ren led the way, their movements cautious but purposeful. "Stay close," Ella whispered, gripping her pipe tightly. The infected were near, their guttural growls and shuffling footsteps echoing from the labyrinth of tunnels. The group moved as silently as possible, their fear sharpening their senses. As they turned a corner, the faint glow of a flickering light came into view. The central hub was ahead, a large, open space with a cluster of offices and machinery. "There," Ren whispered, pointing to a door marked security. The problem was clear, the area was crawling with infected. They wandered aimlessly, their glowing eyes sweeping the room as if searching. "How do we get past them?" Marcus whispered. Ren bit their lip, then pointed to a series of shelves stacked with old equipment. "We can climb around the edge of the room. Stay above them." Ella nodded, taking the lead. The group moved carefully, scaling the shelves with deliberate movements. The infected below didn't seem to notice at first, their focus remaining on the ground. As they reached the security office, Ella motioned for Marcus to help her force the door open. Ren watched nervously, their eyes darting between the infected and the door. With a faint creak, the door gave way. The group slipped inside, finding the small room cluttered with monitors and papers. "Find the keycard," Ella ordered. Marcus rifled through the desk while Ella checked the walls. Ren hovered near the door, their body tense. "Got it," Marcus said, holding up a small plastic card. A triumphant moment, but it was cut short. A loud crash echoed through the room as a stack of equipment toppled outside. The infected snapped to attention, their heads jerking toward the noise. "They've heard us," Ren whispered, panic seeping into their voice. Ella grabbed the keycard and turned to the group. "Run!" The infected surged toward the office, their snarls filling the air as the survivors bolted back toward the shelves. Ren trailed behind, their weakened state slowing them down. "Faster!" Ella yelled, pulling Ren up onto the shelves just as the infected closed in. The group scrambled back the way they came, but the infected were relentless, their glowing eyes piercing the darkness. As they reached a junction in the tunnels, Ella stopped, her mind racing. They couldn't outrun them, not in these cramped spaces. "We need to split up," she said, her voice firm. "Are you crazy?" Marcus shouted. They'll follow the larger group, Ella reasoned. We'll distract them and meet at the emergency exit. It's our only chance. Before anyone could argue further, she grabbed Ren and pushed them toward the left path. Go! Stay quiet! The group hesitated, fear etched on their faces. But there was no time for debate, the infected were closing in, and survival meant sacrifice. The tunnels came alive with chaos as Ella's group splintered into two. The infected poured into the junction like a ravenous tide, their snarls reverberating in the confined space. Ella's heart hammered in her chest as she and Ren bolted down the left-hand path, their footsteps echoing against the cold, damp walls. Keep moving, she hissed, gripping Ren's arm to keep them upright. Ren stumbled but managed to stay on their feet. I don't know if I can do this, they panted, their voice ragged with exhaustion. You have to, Ella snapped. Stopping isn't an option. The sound of pursuit was relentless. The infected were faster than Ella anticipated, their glowing eyes flickering like fireflies in the dark. Behind them, the sounds of Marcus and the others leading their own group of infected grew fainter. Ella prayed silently that their plan had worked and the split had diverted enough attention to buy them time. The tunnel narrowed ahead, forcing them to slow their pace. Ren gasped, clutching their side. It's too tight! What if we're trapped? Ella ignored the question, her focus razor sharp. She spotted a side door marked supply access and yanked it open, pulling Ren inside. The room was small and cluttered with rusted tools, broken shelving, and overturned barrels. Ella slammed the door shut, pressing her body against it as the first infected reached the hallway outside. They're right there, Ren whispered, their face pale. Ella motioned for silence. The infected clawed at the door, their nails scraping against the metal. The sound was unbearable, like nails on a chalkboard, but the door held firm. For now? Ella scanned the room. We need something to block the door. Help me! Ren scrambled to help her drag a heavy workbench in front of the door. The infected outside snarled and threw their weight against the barrier, causing the door to shudder violently. That won't hold them for long, Ren said, panic creeping into their voice. Ella grabbed a crowbar from the clutter and shoved it into Ren's trembling hands. It doesn't have to. We just need to find another way out. They searched the room frantically, overturning debris and scanning the walls. At last, Ren pointed to a rusted ventilation grate near the ceiling. There! Ella pulled over a barrel and climbed onto it, yanking at the grate with all her strength. It groaned in protest, but the metal eventually gave way, revealing a narrow shaft. Go! She ordered, boosting Ren up into the vent. Ren hesitated. What about you? I'll be right behind you. Just go! Ren crawled into the vent, their thin frame barely fitting through the tight space. Ella followed, pulling herself up just as the door gave way and the workbench toppled to the ground. The infected poured into the room, their glowing eyes scanning for movement. Ella held her breath, praying they wouldn't think to look up. Ren froze ahead of her. Ella, they whispered, their voice shaking. What? Ren pointed to the far end of the vent. A pair of glowing eyes stared back at them from the shadows, accompanied by the low, guttural growl of an infected. Ella's stomach dropped. They were trapped. Back out, she whispered, motioning for Ren to retreat. But as they began to move, the infected in the room below caught sight of them. A chorus of snarls erupted as the creatures clawed at the walls, leaping toward the vent. Move faster, Ella shouted, shoving Ren forward. The infected in the vent lunged, its skeletal hand reaching for Ren's leg. Ella swung her pipe with all her strength, connecting with the creature's head. It let out an ear-splitting shriek but kept coming. Ren scrambled forward, kicking wildly to free themselves. The vent creaked under their combined weight, the thin metal threatening to give way. We're not going to make it, Ren cried. We will, Ella growled, swinging the pipe again. This time, the blow sent the infected tumbling backward into the dark. They reached the end of the vent and dropped into another tunnel. The metal floor beneath them groaned ominously as they landed. Ren clutched their side, gasping for air. We can't keep this up. We have to, Ella said, pulling them to their feet. We're close now. The emergency exit has to be nearby. Ahead, the faint glow of an exit sign illuminated the tunnel. Relief surged through Ella, but it was short-lived. The snarls of the infected echoed from both directions, closing in fast. "There's no time to think," she said, dragging Rin toward the light. They burst into the open air, the emergency exit leading to a barren field bathed in moonlight. But the infected were right behind them, spilling out of the tunnel like a wave of death. Ella spotted an abandoned vehicle nearby, its doors open and keys still in the ignition. "Run!" she screamed, pulling Rin toward the car. The infected surged closer, their screams tearing through the night as Ella and Rin dove into the vehicle. She jammed the key into the ignition, praying it would start. The engine roared to life. Ella hit the gas, the tires screeching as the car sped away from the horde. The infected gave chase but quickly fell behind, their figures fading into the darkness. For the first time in days, Ella allowed herself to breathe. But even as the adrenaline faded, a sickening thought gnawed at her mind. This wasn't over. Not yet. The car sped down the empty road, its tires biting into the asphalt as they left the festival grounds behind. Ella's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white, the engine's roar filling the oppressive silence between her and Rin. The night outside was thick with shadows, the occasional flicker of a passing light the only indication that they weren't alone in the vast, desolate landscape. Rin sat hunched beside her, their face pale, their breaths ragged. What happened to us?" Rin asked, their voice trembling. "What was that thing we took?" Ella's mind raced, but the answer eluded her. The drug, Glory, was supposed to be just another chemical high. But what it had done! What it had turned people into! It was no longer about getting high, it was about survival. The night air felt colder now, as if the very world around them was turning against them. Ella glanced over at Rin, who was still shaking, their body still too thin, too fragile. "Are you okay?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Rin didn't respond right away, instead staring out the window with wide, unblinking eyes. The glow of the dashboard illuminated their gaunt features, making them appear even more skeletal. "Why did it stop?" Rin finally whispered. "Why did they stop attacking?" Ella didn't have an answer. She thought about the madness of the past few days, the brutality, the chaos, and how, without warning, it had all come to a halt. As suddenly as it started, the drug had worn off, and the infected had reverted to their normal, human forms. But the horror wasn't over. Ella shuddered, the image of the people she had known, the ones who had changed and eaten their own, still fresh in her mind. What had they done? What had she done? "Did we?" Rin's voice broke, cutting through her dark thoughts. "Did we eat people?" Ella's stomach churned at the question, her mind flashing back to the blood-soaked faces of the infected. The screams! The carnage! She had seen it all! She had watched as they turned on each other, as the people they once knew had become little more than animals driven by hunger. And when she looked back on it, she wondered how much of it had been their fault. How much of it had been the drug? "Yes," she answered hoarsely, the word like acid in her mouth. "We did!" Rin recoiled, but Ella couldn't look away. She could feel their eyes burning into her, but she couldn't stop the truth from coming out. "It wasn't us, Rin. It was the drug," she said, her voice cracking under the weight of her words. "It wasn't us." But deep down, Ella knew the truth, it was them. They had all become something else, something monstrous, something that had reveled in the violence and destruction. Glory had taken them, and though it was over, the damage was irreversible. She glanced at Rin, who was staring at their own hands as if they could still see the blood beneath their skin. "We couldn't control it," Rin whispered, as though trying to convince themselves as much as Ella. The silence in the car was suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic thrum of the engine. Ella couldn't bring herself to speak again, the weight of what they had survived pressing on her chest like a vice. "We should have stayed," Rin muttered after a while, their voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe we could have helped." Ella shook her head, the faint echo of those days haunting her. "No! No one could have helped! Not once it started! We had to get out! We had to survive!" But the truth was darker than that. They had done more than just survive, they had killed, they had consumed, they had lost themselves to the drug's hold. As the car continued down the road, the bright lights of the city started to come into view, distant at first but growing closer with every mile. A strange sense of dread crawled under Ella's skin. The city, the people, the world they were heading toward, it no longer seemed like salvation. Ren's voice shattered the quiet. "What happens when we get there, Ella?" Ella didn't have an answer. All she knew was that the world would never be the same. Nothing would ever be the same again. They weren't just running from the infected anymore. They were running from themselves. From what they had become. The city loomed larger now, the harsh lights casting long shadows across the road. Ella's hands tightened on the wheel as she pushed the accelerator harder. But no matter how fast they drove, she knew, deep down, that there was no escape from what they had done. And as the lights of the city flickered in the distance, Ella couldn't help but wonder, would anyone ever believe them? Would they even believe themselves? For the first time in days, she allowed herself to look at Ren. The look in their eyes was one of pure, unfiltered horror, an understanding that could not be unsaid. Ella could only hope they would never see that look again. But in her heart, she knew the truth. What they had done, what they had become, it would haunt them forever. Because glory had not only taken their bodies, it had taken their souls. The city greeted them like a cold, indifferent stranger. Tall buildings loomed above them, their windows reflecting the harsh streetlights below. The sounds of the city, distant car horns, chatter, the rustling of papers in the wind, felt alien to Ella now, as though she had stumbled into a world she no longer recognized. It was the same city they had left days ago, but it felt different, too clean, too normal. How could it still function when everything that had happened at the festival was still rattling inside her? Ella pulled the car over to the curb, the tires screeching as she jerked the wheel. The engine sputtered and died, but she didn't care. She had driven them as far as she could. The silence that followed was deafening. Ren stared out the passenger window, their face unreadable. Ella had tried to keep her focus on the road, but the memories wouldn't leave her. The scent of blood, the sounds of bones breaking, the faces of people they had once known, now reduced to husks, driven by a single, primal need. "We're here," Ella said, her voice hoarse, though she wasn't entirely sure to whom she was speaking. It wasn't as much a relief as it was a lingering dread. Ren didn't respond. Their hands clenched in their lap, their gaze unfocused. Every inch of their body seemed to carry the weight of everything they had witnessed, everything they had done. Ella got out of the car, the cool night air biting at her skin as she stood on the sidewalk. She wasn't sure what she was expecting, maybe a welcoming party, maybe the police. But no one was there, not a single soul in sight. The streets were eerily quiet. "Where do we go now?" Ren finally spoke, their voice breaking the stillness like a stone thrown into a pond. Ella didn't know how to answer that. What did you do when you had run from everything that had been real? The festival, the infected, the destruction, they had all vanished like smoke in the wind. No one would ever believe them, no one would understand. Not after what they had done. "We need to find somewhere safe," Ella said, her voice far more steady than she felt. "Somewhere to figure out what happens next." But deep down, she knew there was no escaping it. The nightmare was inside them now, festering, waiting. They had taken the drug, they had lost control, and the consequences were too monstrous to even comprehend. The sound of footsteps drew her attention. A figure was approaching from the shadows, moving with an odd, deliberate gait. Ella's heart raced. It was too late to hide, too late to escape. The figure stepped into the light. It was a man, tall, with short cropped hair and a weathered face, dressed in a jacket that looked out of place for the time of year. His eyes were hollow, distant, but there was something in them, a spark of recognition. "You," he said, his voice low but sharp. Ella's breath caught. Ren shifted uncomfortably beside her. "Do we know you?" The man took a step closer, scanning them both with a mixture of curiosity and unease. "I heard about what happened," he muttered. "You too, you're from the festival. You made it out." Ella tensed. "How do you know that?" He gave a thin, humorless smile. "I was there, too." I wasn't one of the lucky ones, though. The words hit Ella like a slap to the face. Lucky ones? Had he, too, taken the glory? Had he been one of the infected, one of the monsters that had rampaged through the night? You're not one of them, are you? Ren asked hesitantly. The man's smile faltered, and his eyes shifted to the ground. No. I wasn't. I just saw the aftermath. And you? He hesitated, glancing at Ella. I don't know if I should even be talking to you. You've seen what happens. What we become. His voice lowered, becoming almost a whisper. You've seen what it turns us into. Haven't you? Ella's stomach turned. She couldn't avoid the question. Couldn't hide from the truth that had been hanging over them since that first night when the drug took hold. She nodded slowly. We've seen it. The man stepped closer, his expression darkening. You're not the only ones who survived, he said. There are others out there. People who weren't so lucky. People who didn't make it out. What happened to them? Ella asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. They're gone, the man said, his voice grim. And you know what? Some of them came back, too. Like you did. Just like you. But not quite the same. Ren took a step back, alarmed. What do you mean? The man glanced nervously over his shoulder, as though to make sure no one was listening. He leaned in closer, his voice barely audible. They're still out there. The infected. They look normal now, but they're not. They've seen what they can do, and now they're hunting. They're hunting for anyone who survived. Anyone who didn't take glory. Ella felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The city, the place they thought they were safe, was already infected. Not with the drug, but with the fear, the paranoia. The infection had taken root in their minds, in their hearts. They're coming for us, she said, the realization hitting her like a ton of bricks. Aren't they? The man's silence was all the confirmation she needed. Before she could say anything else, a distant scream pierced the night. It was sharp, chilling, the kind of scream that sounded too human to ignore. A flare of panic shot through Ella's chest. They've found us, Ren whispered, fear creeping into their voice. Get in the car, Ella ordered, her pulse quickening. Now! They ran back toward the vehicle, but it was too late. A group of figures emerged from the shadows, their faces pale, their eyes wide and unfocused. The infected. They were all around them. And this time, they were waiting. Ella's mind raced, but her body acted before she could think. The man was already turning, sprinting into the night, his footsteps swallowed by the darkness. Ella grabbed Ren by the arm, pulling them toward the car. There was no time to think. They had to get away. And this time, it wasn't just survival. It was a fight for everything that was left of their humanity. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the empty streets, growing louder with each passing second. Ella's heart pounded in her chest as she yanked the door of the car open. Ren hesitated for a moment, looking over their shoulder, but Ella didn't have time to explain. Move! She shouted, urgency flooding her voice. They scrambled into the car, Ella slamming the door shut behind them. The engine roared to life, and for a moment, it seemed like they might escape, but the streets around them were dark, too dark. The figures moved closer, shambling like shadows that were too familiar, too inhuman. There were too many of them. Ella floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching against the asphalt as they lurched forward. She didn't dare look in the rear-view mirror. She couldn't afford to, she knew what would be waiting. The figures weren't just people anymore. They were hunters, predators with vacant eyes and gnashing teeth. They had tasted flesh, and they wouldn't stop until they had more. As the car tore down the street, Ella's hands gripped the wheel tightly, knuckles turning white. She could hear Ren's shallow breaths beside her, but their voice remained silent, the weight of what was happening settling in. The city streets twisted into unfamiliar alleys, and the noise of the infection behind them faded into the darkness. Ella's foot slammed harder on the accelerator, but it felt like every corner they turned brought them closer to a dead end. They couldn't outrun them forever. How much farther? Ren finally asked, voice hoarse. I don't know, Ella replied, her eyes scanning the streets, trying to make sense of the urban labyrinth. Her mind raced, but there was no clear plan, no way out. They had escaped the chaos at the festival, but now they were caught in something much worse. The city wasn't just infected, it was the perfect hunting ground. These people, once high on the glory, now had no memory of their humanity. Their eyes were black with hunger, their hands reaching for the next victim. They had already tasted it. They wouldn't stop. "There's a building up ahead," Ella muttered, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll try to get to it." Ren didn't respond. There wasn't anything left to say. They turned a corner, and the dim light of a nearby street lamp revealed an old, abandoned building, an old warehouse, its windows cracked and boarded up. It was dark, eerily silent. "Is this a trap?" Ren asked, eyeing the building warily. Ella hesitated for only a moment. She wasn't sure. It could be a trap, but they didn't have many options left. They couldn't stay out here in the open. They needed shelter. "We have to try," Ella said, determination creeping into her voice. She parked the car quickly in the shadow of the building, not daring to stay too long in one spot. They both rushed out, the sounds of distant moaning and growling rising in the air. The infected were getting closer. The door creaked loudly as Ella pushed it open, the air inside thick with dust. The building's interior smelled of mildew and decay. Rusted machinery lined the walls, and the dim light from outside barely reached the corners. They moved swiftly through the building, adrenaline forcing them into motion. The silence felt too oppressive, too heavy. As they crept further into the warehouse, the sound of footsteps behind them kept echoing. But when Ella looked back, there was no one there. It felt like they were being watched. Ren was the first to notice a strange, hollow sound in the air. "Did you hear that?" they whispered, voice shaky. Ella nodded slowly. "We're not alone." A sharp noise sliced through the quiet, metal scraping against metal. It was close. Suddenly, the hairs on the back of Ella's neck stood on end. A low growl echoed from somewhere deep in the building, followed by the scraping of claws against concrete. The sound was too unnatural to be anything human. "They're here," Ren muttered, their voice trembling. Ella turned to face the sound, her breathing shallow, her pulse quickening. The growls grew louder, more intense. They were surrounded. "I think we need to split up," Ella said, voice tense. "It's the only way we'll get out of here." Ren glanced at her, confusion flashing in their eyes. "What? No! We can't, it's the only chance we have," Ella interrupted, her voice sharp. "I'll lead them one way, you go the other. We'll meet at the back of the building." Ren didn't argue, but there was a reluctance in their eyes, the same fear that gripped her chest. She didn't want to do this either, but they had no choice. Ella's heart hammered in her chest as she backed away, disappearing into the shadows of the building. The infected were closing in, and she could hear them now, soft footsteps, scraping, sniffing the air. As she moved deeper into the darkness, Ella could feel her own sanity slipping. The building had become a maze, every corner more dangerous than the last. From behind, she heard the shuffle of feet, the low growl of something hungry, something far worse than human. Her breath caught in her throat. She was being stalked. The building felt colder with each passing moment, and Ella's mind was beginning to unravel. She couldn't tell if it was the infection or the fear that was starting to take hold. She had to keep moving. A noise behind her made her stop dead in her tracks. Something, or someone, had seen her. She turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Nothing but shadows stretching across the floor. And yet, she felt it, a presence watching her. The infected. They were closing in. A loud crash echoed from behind her. Ren. The scream that followed made Ella's blood run cold. The echo of Ren's scream reverberated through the building, sharp and guttural, before it was cut off completely. Ella froze, heart pounding in her chest as the sound of the scream faded into a suffocating silence. For a moment, there was no noise. No shuffling, no growls. Only the pounding of her own heartbeat in her ears. She took a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she reached for the flashlight in her pocket. Her fingers brushed the cold metal before she gripped it tightly. The beam of light flickered and then steadied, slicing through the shadows in front of her. "Ren," Ella whispered, her voice barely a breath. She knew it was useless. Ren was gone. The infected, no longer human, had taken them. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't give in. She had to survive. With every step she took deeper into the building, the air grew colder, thicker, as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. The warehouse felt more like a tomb than a refuge, and Ella knew she was running out of time. The infected were still hunting her, drawn to the faintest sound or movement. She couldn't outrun them forever. She moved swiftly, staying low, scanning every corner and shadow. A sudden noise, something scraping against the concrete, sent her heart into overdrive. She turned, but it was just a rat scurrying across the floor. Her breath was ragged, her mind fraying at the edges, but she forced herself to push forward. The back exit of the warehouse was still a good distance away, and Ella had no way of knowing how many infected were between her and it. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, the weight of invisible eyes pressing against her skin. She didn't dare make a sound. Then, just as she rounded a corner, a sharp hiss came from the darkness. Her flashlight beam caught the glint of something white, a flash of teeth. The infected! It was right there! Ella's blood froze. Its eyes were black, empty, and its mouth hung open, saliva dripping onto the floor as it let out a low, guttural growl. It wasn't just hungry, it was feral, a beast with no trace of humanity left. Before she could react, it lunged. Ella ducked, barely dodging its grasping hands. She stumbled, tripping over a rusted pipe, and fell hard against the cold concrete. Her head slammed against the floor, pain exploding through her skull. For a moment, she thought she might black out. But she couldn't. She had to keep going. Her hand shot out and grasped something solid, an old wrench, forgotten on the floor. It was heavy, and in that moment, it felt like the only thing keeping her alive. The infected lurched forward again, and Ella swung the wrench with all the strength she had left. The blow landed with a sickening thud, and the creature stumbled back. It snarled, its twisted form reeling from the impact, but it wasn't enough to stop it. Not yet! Ella scrambled to her feet, adrenaline coursing through her veins, and ran. She had no plan, no backup, just the desperate need to escape. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The nightmare was close behind. The back door was in sight, barely visible through the haze of panic clouding her mind. She was almost there. A deafening crash sounded behind her. She spun, half expecting to see another infected at her heels, but this time it was different. Ren! Or what was left of them. The infected creature that had once been her friend stood in the doorway, its body contorted and unnatural. Its eyes, dark and empty, locked onto her with an unmistakable hunger. The remnants of Ren's face were barely visible beneath the distorted, monstrous features that now dominated their body. They were lost. Consumed by the drug, by the madness. Ella froze, shock freezing her in place. But Ren didn't move forward. They stood there, motionless for a heartbeat, before they let out a low growl. Then, just as quickly as they had appeared, they crumpled to the floor. The infection was wearing off. Ella didn't know whether to scream or collapse in relief. Her legs felt like they would give out beneath her, and her chest was tight with the weight of everything that had happened. The creatures around her were fading too. Their movements became sluggish, their once violent hunger subsiding. Ella stumbled backward, her mind reeling. She turned and ran for the door, throwing it open with all her remaining strength. She didn't stop. She didn't look back. The outside world was just as she had left it, silent, empty, and stained with the aftermath of the horrors they had endured. The sky was just beginning to lighten, the faintest hint of dawn creeping over the horizon. The drug, glory, had lost its hold. But the consequences remained. Ella's breath was ragged, her body trembling from the exertion and fear, but she kept walking. The city around her seemed so empty now, the echoes of the festival long gone, swallowed up by the chaos of the night. There were no survivors. She was the last. As she stumbled toward the horizon, a single, haunting thought pierced through her mind: what did they do? She had survived, yes. But at what cost? The memories of Ren, of the others, gnawed at her insides. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had somehow become part of something larger, something darker. Something that would never be washed away. The last remnants of the glory drug lingered in her system, and Ella knew deep down that the horrors they had faced would never truly end. They would haunt her, follow her, in every shadow and every whisper. In the distance, she heard the faint sound of footsteps behind her. She didn't turn around. She knew it wasn't over. The infected had faded, but something much darker remained. And it would find its way back. As the sun rose higher, the world remained in ruins. And the price of survival was never truly paid.